Okay.
Okay, auto transcription should be on. My screen should be sharing, and you should be able to see me. Is all of that correct so far?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. So our studio tonight is unit testing. So I'm going to have, is text legible on both sides?
Yes.
Do I need to make things
On the
bigger?
left, if it could be a little bit larger.
Like that?
I can deal with that.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
All righty, so real quick, we'll go over what our project is. So I opened up our project. We have a few files. We have index.js. Then we have a spec file. This is our testing file. It's where we're running on our test. Then we have our function. Our function's name is launch output. It takes a number, and so far it does nothing. So we're going to be using the code launch output in order for this. And then most of our code will be right in here. And this will be our test. So we're doing test-driven development. What that means is we determine how we're going to write it before we write it by testing to see if the code works. So the first thing we need to do is we need to write a test. And so let's go ahead and start that. We have our describe already, which says describe the name of our function launch output. We'll do whatever. So far, it doesn't do anything. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go it, which says launch output will do whatever. So we're going to give it a string, and it's going to be returns. As you can see right here, we're looking at line 1. So we can scroll down a little. It says write our first test. So we can go line 1. It goes return string launch bang when visible only by 2. And then what we're going to do there is we're going to give it a comma inside our parentheses because that is the string. And then our function, we go function, and then we open up our block. So now we're in our code block. Inside our code block, we want to go let actual code. So the code we're actually getting, and that is running our function, launch output of the number we want to give it, which here is 2. Nice and simple. So we're writing our first test. And so far what we have is describe launch output when it returns launch bang when divisible only by 2. The function is going to be let actual equal launch output of 2. And then let expected equal the string that we're expecting, which is launch bang.
Yes.
We're going to go launch bang. And then now we run the
I
actual
know
line of
Elijah
code.
went to.
Oh, was there a
he said he was
question?
going to the studio review.
I
Say
think
that
somebody
again?
needs to mute.
Hey, Tia, you're on. You need to mute.
Oh, okay. I thought someone had a question. Okay.
I do have a quick question.
Yes,
Bree,
go for it.
Just for clarification. So whenever we are doing testing in this regard, is it better practice to put const or let for the actual and expected?
I don't use const very often because, so when you're using const, in my opinion, const is being used when the same variable is being used over and over and you're not changing it.
Okay.
As of right now, in our current line of code, when would we use actual again?
Pretty often, 8 different times.
Are we? Are we with, because remember that we're inside a function right now. It means we're inside
Oh,
scope.
well, then never.
Never. So why would we give it const?
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, so we have to think about when we're declaring variables for const and let. Constants normally need to be more global. And so if we give this const here, it won't even be accessed in a future test because it's scoped inside this current test.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. So now we're gonna go, correct me if I'm wrong here, because this is not the way that I do this, but I think it just is expect of actual, and then give me a second. I don't actually remember the way y'all are supposed to do this. I was about to do it wrong. I have to look it up real quick to make sure I use the right syntax.
Oh, you don't have to.
Okay, there we go. Uh,
I already hear my
you don't want to do that. We won't.
I think it's supposed to be dot to equal.
to equal. Is that it? Okay.
Yeah.
Back to.
Okay.
Well, there we go. But there's multiple different ways to do this and multiple different clients that exist or whatnot. And so the way that I learned to do this and the code, the syntax I use is not the syntax. So that's why it took me a second. So now in there, inside our to equal, we put expected, which is our variable, right? So this is our current code. When describe launch output, it returns launch when divisible only by 2. So now we're going to run it. And it fails. As you can see, we get an F up here. So this basically, we're going to run through this real fast. Randomize with seed, that's just details that aren't really important. Started is telling us it started. This is going to list all of our tests. It's going to have F's or periods, I think. I think this one uses periods. Some use F, some use 2, but I think this one uses F's and periods. So we'll have F's and then periods. We got an F, which means the first test failed. And then our failures get defined by using the it term that we used. It goes describe it. So launch output, returns launch, and then it explains what happened.
No, just complete it all on there.
Hey, folks, can we check mute, please?
And then it explains what happened. And so it goes expected undefined, which means we got actual was undefined. That's what that's saying. Undefined is actual. And then launch is our expected. So it's saying undefined was not launched, didn't work. So now what we need to do is we need to go through to this line of code, and now we need to make this work. So what we need is we need a line of code that determines if it's divisible by 2. So let's go ahead and output something. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go if num is module, and modular means the remainder. So if the remainder 2 is strictly equal to 0, we want it to do something. So here, we're going to go ahead and return launch. Bang. Well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to return launch bang, right? So now let's run our code. Now it passed. See how we got this green period? That tells us it passed. The 1 spec means it passed, and then it tells you the failures, how long it took, and then it tells you the seed, which has to do with Jasmine, which is not really important. Any questions?
Why does an F still show up at the top?
Because I didn't clear out Replit. I don't generally clear out my console log.
So I did want to point out, because I am also curious about this myself. In our studio, we had figured out that like the way that we had did it was kind of more like a little bit more specific than like the example had shown. But we put if num %2 sign equals 0 and num %3 sign is not equal to 0 and num %5 is
Can I
not
ask
equal to
why?
5. That's I guess what I'm asking you.
Okay, that I can help with. So let's look at what the assignment says. The assignment tells us our test is, let's go to the assignment and the test. Our test says returns launch when divisible only by 2. Our current test tests the number 2. There is no 3 in there. There is no 5 in there. It's just 2. So our current test and current code should only take into consideration the number 2.
Why are you yelling?
Why am I yelling? I'm just very loud. I'm just a very loud person. That's all that is. So in this case, launch 2, it only matters. Like it's the only number that matters. We don't need to worry about the next test because we haven't gotten there yet. So we want to only focus on the individual tests that we're working on. We don't want to get too advanced or too far because then we bypass the whole purpose of test-driven development.
I got you. So just to clarify, so I can like, just so I'm following. Does it have to be in that line of code? Does it have to be 2, that we're like putting after the launch output? Because we put 4 and we like put like different numbers for every single one. So for like the divisible by only 3, we put 9, or divisible by only 5, we put 25.
Okay, let's talk about what is simpler, 2 or 4 when divisible by 2.
2.
So why are we making it more complicated?
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, when coding, we want to be as simple as possible. You do not want to overcomplicate things. The more complicated things get, the more confused you can possibly get, and the more likely you can make an error. So we want things really simple. So in this situation, I'm going to use the lowest iteration for every element. If it says 2, I'm using 2. If it says 3, I'm using 3. If it says 2 and 3, I'm using the first number that hits both. I'm keeping it as simple and neutral and natural as possible. Like, I do not want to overcomplicate anything.
Okay.
Henry,
think
do
I
you have-
was- I
The
think I was
future
just
tests will go in and complicate things more.
gotcha. I think I was just thinking more of along the lines of like as I was like, everything was unfolding, I was assuming that the reason why we did that was to make the code as dynamic as possible.
Go ahead. I heard a question.
I think that was just,
Okay.
but Henry, to your point real quick, in our small group, someone else wanted to do that as well. And I'm with Bree. I'm like, why would we do that? Why? Because the whole purpose is to make it readable to your next handoff, right?
So
Right.
about being dynamic, our code so far only has one requirement. So you can read this and look at all the requirements, but when you're doing test-driven development, you only look at it requirement by requirement. So
like
in our
sequentially?
minds, this is the only thing that our code should be doing. So if
Okay.
we add anything else, we are making over complex code for no reason.
Okay.
As we add more tests, we will modify our code to be more dynamic.
All right. Answer my question. Thank you.
No problem. So now our test passed, so we're going to move to the next test, right? Now, there's 2 ways to do this. I can retype everything, or I tend to be a lazy coder. I'm going to copy this test, I'm going to paste, and then I'm going to modify it based on my next test. So I'm going to go code when divisible only by 3. I'm going to change my 2 to a 3, and I'm going to change my expected to code, leaving in the bang, and I'm going to hit run. This test fails, right? So now I need to change my code again. Now I need another if statement, right? I need if num percent equal strictly equal 3. Oh shoot. 3 0, my bad. 3 0. And now we want to return again. So we'll go ahead and return code, bang. Now we run. That one works. Any questions so far? Sweet. So we'll move to the next one. Means we can copy our code, because so far only a small bit of the code is changing, right? A small bit of our test. So now all that changes is here. So we change code to rocks. We change 3 to 5. Oh, I don't need that. 5. We change 3 to 5. And we change code rocks. Now we run our test. We get a failure. So we get an F dot dot. So failure 2 passes. We go back here. Now we need a third one. At this point, we can just copy this because it's the same thing. Now we change 3 to 5 and code to rocks. And then run our code. So we've got it. 3 passes, 0 failures. So now let's clear that. Any questions? Okay, moving on. We are now on test 4. It says when passed a number that is divisible by 2 and 3, return launch code. So we're going to go ahead. This is different than our previous ones. Our previous tests were return single string when divisible by single number. This is return a compound string when divisible by multiple numbers. So in this case, I'm not just going to copy and paste because I don't want to make a mistake. I'm going to go ahead and restart it because my formatting is slightly different. And then we go function. So we type, I hate this thing. Get out of that. It returns launch code bang when divisible by 2 and 3. Then function no parameter, block code starts. And then our block code is going to be very similar. We're going to go let actual equal our function that we're testing, launch output of 2 and 3. The most simple lowest is 6. So we're going to go 6. And then we're going to go let expected equal. Oh, what just happened? Is it still working? Can everyone still see me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can
Okay,
still
good.
see you and hear you.
Zoom gave me a notification that I had been signed out. So as long as it is still recording and still seeing, we're just going to keep moving on.
Maybe you were still logged into the other Zoom.
It's probably on one of my other work computers, most likely. One of my work computers might have booted up or something or knocked me off, which is probably what happened. So we're going to go let expected equals launch code. Right, and then we will go expect of actual to equal expected. Now we'll run our code and our code fails, right? Because it returns launch. So now this is where we can do a few things. Now what we need to do is we need to return launch and we need to return code. So we could do it one way. We could do it like this. We could go if num is not here. We could go up here and say and num where is it? Modular not equal to 3. That means we would bypass this loop, right? We would get out of it. But that's not actually the most efficient way to do this. What we're doing is we're returning a string every single time, right? So our output is always a string. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable called output, and we're going to set it to blank. Then at the end of our code, we're going to return this output. Return output. So now we have a single return statement. So what's going to happen is we're going to change all of these returns. And we're going to change it instead to output plus equal. Mine's supposed to be equal plus. Sometimes I forget. That's okay. We'll figure it out in a second. They'll let us know. If someone remembers if it's supposed to be the equal first or the plus first, go ahead and shout it out. But I don't remember off the top of my head.
Plus equal.
It's plus equals? Okay. I know they both work, but they do different things. Alrighty, so what we're doing now is as our code happens, if it's divisible by 2, it's going to add launch bang to our code. If it's divisible by 3, it's going to add code bang. If it's divisible by 5, it's going to add rocks bang. So we'll run our code, and it failed because there's an extra bang in there. So we're going to look at what our code is supposed to do, and we look at our tests, and we see that a bang is at the end of every line, right? So what we're going to do here is add the bang at the bottom. We're going to go output plus equals bang. And then we're going to run our code. And now that we see that it passed. And our previous test passed. Any questions so far? Okay, we'll move on to the next one. So our next one, as it can say, is 3 and 5. Well, that is similar to our previous format. So we're going to copy lines 24 through 28, and we're going to paste. Now we're going to change the string that gets returned, which in this case is code space rocks, and it's divisible by 3 and 5. So we're going to change that 2 to a 3, that 3 to a 5. We're going to change line 31 from launch put of 6 to launch put of 15. And we're going to change line 32 from expected launch code to expected code rocks. Now we're going to run our code. It still failed. And it failed because it expected the variable we got is code no space rocks exclamation to equal code space rocks bang. So now we need to go back to our code and make this work. So now as we can see, we need a space, right? So the easiest way is to just add a space. So let's go ahead and run our code. Oh, now we see that we failed a previous test. We failed the test when it's divisible only by 5. And the reason that we failed this test is because there's now a space where there shouldn't be. So a neat trick is that is called white space. It's just empty space before or after. There is a great function that exists. So what we're going to do is we're going to go output plus equals. We're going to call our variable output, and we're going to run a method called trim. What trim does is it removes trailing and leading white space. So any spaces in a string at the beginning or at the end get removed. So we're going to go ahead and run our code. What did I do here? Oh, code. Oh, I had my code. What happened? Oh, I broke something. Oh, I don't like Replit. Give me a second. I don't know how to fix this.
He need to drag the console down, maybe.
It's not letting me.
I think you can see your last, there's a way to go back and see your last bit of code. And
I just refreshed the
There it
code. Okay, there we go. Okay, so now let's run it. So now our code is doubling. We're getting code. So why is that happening? Because what's happening is, because line 16, I added output to it. So I went plus equals when I need to go just equals. So now when we run it, we'll see that all of my tests pass. Because what's happening is I'm concatenating multiple times, and then at the very end, I remove my white space. Questions so far? Okay, we'll move to our next test, which is test 6, when passed a number divisible by 2 and 5. That's the same format as this one. So we're going to go ahead and copy. We're going to paste. And this says it needs to be launch rocks. So we'll change this. And we'll change that 3 to a 2. And on line 37, 15 will become 10. And on line 38, code rocks becomes launch rocks. And we run our code. All of our tests pass. And that's just because we wound up coding in a way that when we modified our code to handle the new situation, it took into consideration our future tests. Now, that was not necessarily our intent. Our intent was just to make those tests work, but sometimes that happens. So now we're going to move on to the next test. We don't need to go and do anything because this test is still working. So our next test is line 7, which is being given 3 numbers. So we're going to go ahead and retype this one. We'll go, it returns go back to line 42. Okay, it returns launch code rocks exclamation when divisible by 2, 3, and 5. And then we move into our let actual. So now we're going to go our function of nothing, open our block. Our block is then going to go let actual equal our function launch output of 30. I think that's the lowest denominator. Yeah. And then we'll go let expected equal our string of launch code rocks ending in a bang. And then we will expect of actual to equal of expected. run our code. And we'll see that that one also passed. Because of the way we did with our outputs, it's just continuing to work so far. So we'll move on to our next test. Dang, I did it again. Okay, there we go. Let's clear. So now we move on to our next test. Our next test is very similar to this one. So we're going to copy it. It goes, it returns, and I'm just going to copy this over. Rutabagas. And I see I made a misspelling up here, so I'm going to go back and change, make sure all those are good. So now we're going to change, it returns when not divisible by 2, 3, and 5. So we could do 0 or we can do 1. I'm going to start with 1 because I tend to try to only use 0 during situations I specifically need 0. So 1 is going to be the number that I want to use here, at least for me. And then we're going to copy this over. We're going to paste. That needs to be a double. And this needs to be a double. And then there we go. And now we're going to run our code. Let's not go all the way. So now we get an error. What we wound up returning is a bang. All we got was a bang. So let's go look at our code and figure out why we got a bang and why that one didn't work. So if we look at line 15, what happens is no matter if any of these pass or fail, we output a bang, right? So we need an if statement to determine if we need to add the bang or if we want to do rutabagas, right? So what we're going to wind up doing is using an if statement with output. So output is currently set to a blank string. That string is falsy. So we're going to stick output in here, or truthy, I mean, actually, sorry. Blank strings are, yeah, no, a blank string is falsy. Something with it is truthy. So if output is truthy, means if output evaluates to true, we want it to do something, which means what we want it to do is this code that we were running. So we're going to stick it there. All right. So now let's run our code. We'll see now we're getting an empty string. It's no longer appending that bang because it's only doing it when code's already been added to output. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go else. So if output is not truthy, we want to output equals rutabagas. That doesn't work. Those are important. So now we're going to go ahead and run our code. And we see that now it passes. So now we've gone through those first 8 tests. And that means we are on new condition. So now that our function passes all 8 tests, we're going to change one of the conditions. It says for a case where a number is divisible by 2 and 5, instead of returning launch rocks, we want the function to return launch rocks trash. So that means we need to go to that test because that's the test that's changing. We find 2 and 5. The variable is no longer launch rocks. It's now this. So we're going to copy this over and we're going to change launch rocks to launch rocks crash. Right? So now we're going to go expected here. And we're going to change it to that. So when we run this code, it fails because it gets launch rocks. So there's a few ways to do this. The simplest way in our basic code, so it winds up getting here if output is this, and then we move to else. The next thing that we can do is we can add an if else. So we're going to go if else here. And what we want is if else, or is it else if? It's else if in JavaScript, I think. I could be wrong here. That's fine. We'll figure it out in a second. What?
It's else if. It is else if.
Okay, that's what I
And
thought.
there's a blank in between. Bree.
Okay. Yeah, different languages. I haven't been using JavaScript most recently, so I'm not surprised that I got that wrong.
Yeah, Python shortens it to elif.
I generally code in XML most often, an XSLT, and it doesn't use any of this. So we'll go else
Well,
if.
does XML even have control flow?
XML doesn't, but XSLT does. So else if, what we're gonna do here is we want if output is equal to launch rocks. Now, if it's equal to launch rocks, what we're gonna do is we're gonna wind up concatenating again. We're gonna go output plus equals, because it doesn't change the whole thing, it just adds something. So we're gonna go add a space, and then we're gonna do this big crash thing. Guess I have to. Guess I don't have. There we go. Crash and 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4, and then we're gonna close it. So now let's run our code. Oh, let's close that. Run our code. What did we get? We got, oh, it failed again. So it looks like it expected launch rocks to equal launch rocks crash. So it looks like it is not still getting here. Why is that happening? Alrighty, we're just going to troubleshoot real fast. So what we're going to do, it doesn't look like we're getting here. So we're going to go add a console.login real fast. No, we won't. Let's see. So else if output launch rocks plus equals crash. So we're not getting into this if statement. What did I do wrong here? Give me 1 second. I'm just looking real quick. Oh, I know the problem. So my problem is it went else, it went if, no, else if should still work. Oh, that's because in this if statement, if this is true, it doesn't get to this one. So currently the logic here works, but we're having some issues with how it's being executed, right? So we're gonna go ahead and rearrange some of this. So I'm gonna go and start a new if. We're gonna go if, and I'm gonna reverse this. I'm gonna go if output doesn't exist, right? And then I'm gonna set output equal to this. Now, after that, I'm gonna go else if and we're gonna check for launch rocks, but now we have to check without an exclamation mark because it doesn't have it yet, which is fine. It's not a big deal. So if output equals launch rocks, no exclamation. We're gonna go ahead and concatenate this. Because this does not have an exclamation mark at the end, we need to add that into our output. Then we're gonna run another else. So then we're gonna go else. So at this point, what our code does, if output is blank, it's going to change that to rutabagas. Else if it's not blank and it's equal to launch rocks, it's going to append that. For any other situation, what we want our code to do is the rest of the code that we had. So basically, we are reversing the logic that we were using because we need it to only be true once. And in this logic, if this is true, it won't get there. But if this is true, or if this is false, it'll get there and it'll go down. So we had to change the order in which we are doing our ifs and else statements. So now we're going to go ahead and run our code. And now we see that they all pass. Any questions before we move into the bonus missions?
I do, Bree. Real quickly, I guess I missed the part where, because right now my output is, the expected is saying launch, launch. I think I missed what we did to keep it from repeating, like launch, launch. not-
I don't know what line it's gonna be, but wherever you have this line, output equals output trim, make sure there's not a plus.
Just, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's all it is. There's a plus there. So we're gonna go over, this is your studio. We're gonna go over these bonus missions. I have not looked at them. So let's see what this says. And I will decide, depending on what it's asking me, if this is something I will do live or not. Because it may be something that I just don't know to do off the top of my head, or it might be something that if I try to do it live, y'all will get really confused. So our first bonus mission is drawing the code. And it says it examines launch output and the describe functions. Notice there's quite a bit of repetition in the code. Try adding arrays, objects. It is very possible that your code is not like this and that there was a lot of repetition. There is very little repetition in this code. Actually, it's not there. So I don't need to bother with the launch output. And it says arrays, objects, or loops.
I said there you could cut out some of the variable declarations and just and save some characters with arrow functions. So instead of declaring variables, you could just have an arrow function that does
We don't use
the
arrow functions in launch code, Raiden. I appreciate that. But as a TA, I'm specifically told I'm not allowed to use arrow functions.
Very well.
Yeah. So yes, arrow functions would make this easier, and I code in arrow functions, but I'm not allowed to use arrow functions when live coding because I don't want to confuse students. If you're curious about arrow functions and what Raiden's talking about, feel free to message me later and I'll go over them, but it's not something I can discuss in a big group setting. The only thing I can think to make this easier is theoretically, we could just take this where actual is, but that's not as legible, so I'm not going to do that. There's a few ways you could use arrays if you really wanted. You could, I don't know, we could do this. We can make an object. Let's go output, object. This may or may not work. I'm just kind of winging this right now, but I think this is something that we can do.
My thought was you could do some kind of template literal and do a little bit of ternary function.
Yeah, you could definitely use ternary functions, but it specifically asks us to use arrays, objects, and loops. So that's what I'm trying to do. Like I would do this with ternary functions. So
do we have to use arrays in this file or in that test file?
Honestly, I have no idea what it's asking.
Because
So I'm just going to be upfront.
we did those arrays and the if loop in the test file itself.
You could use arrays in here, absolutely. Like you definitely could. Right now I'm working on the objects part. So I'm kind of just winging this, so this may or may not work, everyone. Oh, okay. So if you get confused at this point, that's fine. I'll explain it shortly. So what I'm doing is I made a I made a an object called output object. Then I made I'll change this to output nums. I made an array called output nums, which is 2, 3, and 5. And then I went for let num of, which this is going to be a for loop that uses num will be 2, 3, 5. So we're going to go output nums. And then for each one, we're going to go output plus equals output object nums. Right? So what this loop should do is it should do all of this part. So let's test this now. I don't know if this is going to work at all, to be honest, but it might. Undefined, undefined, undefined. Okay, that didn't work. I'm going to do a console.log real quick, run my code. And if you scroll to the top, no, let's cancel that. Somewhere in here, it should give you a bunch of, there we go. So 2, 3, 5. So it is giving me 2, 3, 5, which means my undefined is output plus equals. It's probably this part's not working. So let's go ahead and see, stick this in there real fast and see what we're getting. We're getting a bunch of undefineds. All right, so what we do, let's change these. I don't know if this will work or not. I don't think this is going to work, but we're going to look at it for a second. Oh, it's not working. Oh, that's why. Okay, so what I did is I'm sticking the whole array here when all I need is num. That's why this is failing. That should be num. Right, that's going to fix it. However, honestly, it's still going to fail, but it'll fail for a different reason. Oh, I gotta refresh. So now what's happening is we're always getting launch code rocks. And that's because all we did is appended it for each number. So what we need to do is we need to do if, and actually, I think I want to remove these now that I fixed that. I want to go back to actual numbers. So, change those to numbers. And I think that should work. So now we're going to go if num, we're going to change this to nums because we can't have num twice. So nums. If num module nums is strictly equal to 0, we're going to go ahead and run this line of code. We'll hit run. And we see that all of our tests pass. Does anyone have any questions about this version?
Does JS only cast the property keys to strings if you type them like as not as another kind of literal and it's not an identifier?
JavaScript is very loose. where, so like if I make this a string, I think it's still gonna work, actually. Because here, this part, num is a num, and this number is a num, right? And so it's just going to realize that
it would coerce to it anyway.
Yeah,
I was just wondering
should just
in
still
terms
work.
of,
See,
I'm saying like if you like if say you like if you like if you console.log the output object, you know, is it going to keep those as numbers? And doesn't it like isn't
it depends
there
on your environment, to be honest. I think Replo doesn't. I think mine does. It really depends on how your environment is set up. And so it's not necessarily consistent, because in here, it's more concerned about this being a key than it being a number. This is not a variable. This is not necessarily a string. This is a key. So
Yeah,
like
so
here,
it's
it's calling
saying-
it a string, even though I just typed it in a number, but it's a key. So that's all it really cares about.
Yeah, so that was what I was wondering about, is because I thought I did remember something about it turning when you make the object, it turns the keys into strings or something like that.
Yeah, but here it's not that irrelevant because we have this.
Because it's getting coerced to the number.
So I'm assuming that this is what it meant by using, because I use an object, an array, and a loop. So there is the drawing the code. Does anyone have any questions? You would have to keep this output down here. There's no way to use this outside of this part.
Couldn't you also just iterate over the since it's just an object with those keys, couldn't you just iterate over the keys of the object instead of iterating over an array of those keys?
Absolutely. But then I wouldn't have added an array, so I wouldn't have met my requirement.
It says and or.
I did, and I make it harder. No, but I guess you're correct. You could have used any of them. I was just trying to hit arrays, objects, and loops all in one. But no, we could have definitely went what nums of. I think this might cause some issues where we would need to typecast. This might work, this might not work. Output object is not iterable.
It should be nums in.
Yeah, it should be in. And I forget. And when using strings and arrays, if you use in, it gives you the index.
Oh.
Yeah. So nope, that seems to work fine too. So either
Gives
one
you
of
the
these are
index because
acceptable.
the array is an object with the indices as keys.
Correct. But if you use of in strings, arrays, or other non-class objects like this or other objects, it will give you the actual value.
Yeah, of is only for iterables. Is
Correct.
the how it's there.
So what's the next one? Let's see. The next one is if a teammate tried to help you out by writing the launch output code before class, the code contains some error. So, and paste your script, your testing script. Okay, so it wants us to open this code. It's working. We'll look at it. Looks like they wrote a bunch of code here and they want us to paste our code here. So we're gonna go copy, paste. We're gonna drag over here. Okay. So now we need to see what fails. So we're gonna run our code. A whole bunch of stuff broke. Yeah, I don't think that should have broke like that. I don't think that's a problem with our code. Okay, maybe it is with our code. Let's go look. So the first thing we get is we get a reference error. Create output is not defined on line 2319. Yeah, I have no idea. Give me 1 second. Okay, I don't know if that's intentional or not, but our function is not called create output. It's called launch output. So let me look. Launch code, launch output, launch output. Okay, so I have no idea if this is intentional. So all we're going to do is we're going to change this to launch output and hit run. Launch output is not defined. Why is it not defined? Let's look at this. Okay. Let's just copy this line over. Go back over here. I have no idea if this error is intentional or not. And then we'll go over here. There's a whole bunch of nonsense with this. What is going on here? Entry. What's entry? Okay, let's see if that works now. Okay, still not defined. So let's see. Let's look at our test. Let's go back to this one. Look at our test. Okay, so that's what's happening. So it goes constant test, but what we want is launch output. So we got to change that one there as well. And then we'll hit run. Okay, so now all the tests are failing, but things are kind of happening. So we're getting a whole bunch of fails. So there are a few different ways to approach this. I'm going to approach this at looking at each test individually and then reading through my code. So we know that expected rocks to equal rocks. So let's start with divisible by 5. So let's read through our code. What happens? Output entry. If entry, so it goes if entry divided by 2 is equal to 0. It looks like we never get an exclamation mark. So what we need to do, we need to add an exclamation mark. So this is the easiest way to do this without breaking a bunch of stuff. So I think what we're going to do is we're just going to go I'm just going to add an if, or if output exists, I'm going to add an exclamation mark. I think is what I'm going to do. I think this is the easiest way to do it. So now let's run our test. Okay, so now only 5 tests failed. So now what we're looking for was the one divisible by 5. That's not there. So we got that test to pass, right? So we got 3 tests to pass. So now we're going to go to our next one. It returns return launch output, expected launch to equal launch code when divisible by 2 and 3. Okay. So what's happening here is if it hits 2, it stops. Well, because there's an else. So what we're going to do is delete this else statement and hit enter. And delete this else statement and hit enter. And hit run. Now we have 4 failures, so that only fixed one of them. So let's move to the next one. This says launch output returns rutabaga. So it got expected. That doesn't work. Equal rutabagas, that doesn't work. Okay, so it looks like that string is incorrect. There's no period. So we'll add a period here. and we'll run our code again. We're down to 3 failures, so we'll move to this one. Launch output, return code space rocks when divisible by 3 and 5. It looks like it gets code rocks. There's no space. So what we need to do, since we know like there's going to be an outleading space, we could technically do it, but right now we're not because it's not related to this test. We're just going to run it and get another test failed, and then we'll fix it. So now we got the 5 because there's a rocks. So we will come down here and go output equals output dot trim, run the code, oh, clear it, run the code. We only get 1 failure. So we got launch rocks crash to equal launch rocks crash. It looks like there's supposed to be a space that isn't there. So we'll add this space, clear our code, run our code. Oh, we still got a failure, so let's look. Crash, oh, it's not capitalized. So we'll come back down and change that to crash. Run our code. We still got a failure. So let's see, launch rocks. We'll get 1, 2, 3. Oh, there's supposed to be an extra exclamation mark. So as you can see right here, it says crash 4 exclamations. We only have 3. So we'll change our code again. We'll hit run and all of them passed. Any questions?
I have a question, Bree.
Yeah, go for it.
I wanted to know if you could go back to the launch code rocks.js. I'm sorry, the .spec. I just kind of wanted to read through it.
Oh, absolutely. What would you like to look at?
Just kind of scrolling down. I'm actually needing to catch up, so just kind of taking it in.
Does anyone have any questions about what I did? Because that is the whole studio. So now it's just answering questions. I am going to stop the recording at this point, but I will stay on to answer questions. If I can find the button to stop recording. I don't know where the button is. Oh, stop recording.